Welcome back, everyone. Today we are covering chapter 4, so observing and measuring communication variables. Mostly today we're going to just go over some vocabulary and some different methods for getting to the answers that we want. All right, so it's just going to be a lot of jargon today, but these are words and phrases that you just need to be aware of that exist. We'll start to put these into use in the upcoming weeks as we start to put together various research projects. All right, so today we're just learning some terms. Make sure you know what they are, write them down, and we're going to make this one quick. All right. So first and foremost, we've talked about this idea of operationalizing, right? So conceptual is defining an abstract term using other abstract terms. All right. So that's conceptual. So if you want to say something like love, right, it's a deep and tender feeling of affection and devotion. All these are abstract because they're not concrete. We can't measure them, right? We can't, 1, 2, 3, 4, like on a scale of 1 to 10, like we can't directly measure them. So it's all conceptual. So we try to define an abstract term like love using other abstract terms like affection and devotion. Okay. Operationalize, right, or to operationalize a term, right, is we define these abstract terms in terms of measurements. So again, we've discussed this in the last go here, right, is that, love could be defined as how many times, we hug, kiss, talk, etc., right? So how much do you love your mom? Do you love your mom more than I love my mom? There's no real way of measuring it, so we have to go to something that's more operational. Well, how many times a day do you text your mom? When you go home, how many times do you hug your mom, right? Do you kiss your mom goodnight, before bed every night, right? These sorts of things are what we're trying to operationalize in terms of figuring out, who loves their mom more, all right? So conceptual, define an abstract term based on other abstract terms. Operational is we start to take abstract terms and we try to measure them with things that are measurable. So how many times something happens. We know that hugging and kissing and talking for X amount of time doesn't necessarily equal love, but it gets us closer to what love looks like if it could be measured. Conceptual fit is, does your method actually work? So are there elements we left out of a love study that we should put into the next study? So for instance, this is what a conceptual fit would look like, right? So if you say, I love my partner, my romantic partner more than you love your romantic partner, right? You say, okay, well, we're only going to ask one question, all right, with regard to this operationalizing. How many times a day do you text message your partner, right? And you might say, I text message them 100 times, and I say, I only text message my romantic partner twice. You could say, oh, I love my partner more. Well, there's a couple things. You could say, I don't really know if there's a good conceptual fit. I don't know if text messaging is the only method we should use to measure love, right? Because I could say, well, I text message my boss 200 times a day. That doesn't mean I love my boss. It just means that me and my boss have a lot of work to do, and it's happening through text messaging right now, right? I could say, well, maybe I text messaged my romantic partner only twice. You text messaged them 100 times, but the entire time you were text messaging them, it was, fighting over who didn't do the dishes in the sink. All right. So conceptual fit are the methods that I'm using to measure this abstract term, do they actually measure what I think they're measuring, right? So what you do, every time you do a study, if you don't think that it actually got to the heart of love, for instance, you update your methods. It's like, is there a question I should have asked? Is there a question I should have left out? Text messaging in and of itself, the amount doesn't tell us whether or not you love someone more than I love someone, but it gets us close. So we add another question. We say, okay, text messaging isn't 100%, but we're gonna measure how many times you hug your significant other, how much money you spend on them. Spending money on a person doesn't equate love, but it might tell us a little bit of something in connection with all of these other things that we're also measuring, because we can't measure love, but we can measure how much money you spend on dates, how often you text message, how often you hug the person, how often you watch TV together. Like, these things don't in and of themselves equal love, but all together they're getting us closer to love. So we're constantly looking for that conceptual fit. Are we actually measuring what we say it is that we're measuring when it comes to these abstract terms? Triangulation, right? Triangulation, 3, right? Like a triangle, right? What we're doing is we're finding the third point that we cannot see by looking at two other points that you can see. So I'll give you a nice example on the next slide, right? Well, we have things like methodological triangulation, so multiple methods were used to find the answer. So when it comes to a love study, you might do a quantitative survey where you say, how often do you text message your partner? And then you might have people come in and talk about their relationship. So you use a qualitative method. Tell me about your relationship. How did you and your partner meet? How often do you spend time together? Like, tell me about, what's the perfect date night for you? All right. So you're using multiple methods in order to better understand the love that two people have for each other. Data triangulation, you're using multiple sets of data in order to find the answer. We won't worry too much about that in this class. Right, researcher triangulation, so you use multiple researchers, and those researchers might have different perspectives to find the answer. So if you're looking at long-term marriage success rates in men and women partnerships, you might not just want to have a man be the researcher, right? You might, have a man and a woman be a researcher. You might have married people, you might have single people be researchers. Because they're going to look at the data differently and be able to give a different perspective of what the data says. And then you're kind of coming at the data in different ways in order to sort of figure out what actually is true about long-term relationships. And then finally, theoretical triangulation. You're using multiple theoretical approaches to find the right answer. So let's put this in more practical terms. Let's go down here to Malaysia Flight 370, which you all probably heard about in 2014, right? This was the plane over in Malaysia that shortly after takeoff, it lost signal and we never found the plane. All right, big passenger plane. All right, scary situation. They use triangulation in a very practical sense. So in order to find the plane, what they did was they say, okay, where are all the points on the map where we know the plane was? And then based on where those points on the map are, we can try to sort of guess where the third point is, which would be where the missing plane should be. So you look at things like, okay, here's the last audio check, the last time the pilot checked in audibly, flight 370, this is where we're at, here's our position, talking to ground control. There's also these radio pings, so every plane has a GPS in it. As it's flying, it's constantly pinging up on the radar, right? So that's a second point of contact that we have with the plane. The third point is, where's the plane? We're trying to find the plane. That's the third point of this triangulation situation. All right, so you look up here on this map, right? The last contact with a radio, right? Military radar found it, right? We know where the plane took off from, right? So we know 3 points of contact, right? Now we can use these 3 points of contact to start estimating things like time in the air, the height at which it was, the altitude it was at, where it was supposed to be at a certain time. And that helps us to sort of triangulate into where the plane should have been when we lost contact with the plane. All right. So that's what it looks like in a practical sense. You have known points of data, and you're using all these points of data in order to figure out what that third piece of data is, what the conclusion is, which here it's finding the plane. In the previous examples, it's what makes a good marriage. We know this little information, we know this other information. Now we can reach a conclusion that it's a combination of lots of different things. All right, we're going to use multiple researchers to try to interpret this data. We're going to get as many perspectives as we can in on this issue because we know that one perspective isn't the correct perspective, but it helps us get closer to figuring out that missing piece with regard to long-term success, with regard to marriages. All right. Another interesting research project done with triangulation is how do people react to physical environment. Specifically, we're talking about whether or not people are going to buy food in a fast food restaurant. Fast food restaurants are set up in a ways to make you purchase the most amount of food, right, in the shortest amount of time possible because they need to get you out so they can get the next people in. All right. So there's studies that are done that says, okay, let's figure out how do people react in the physical environment with regard to buying burgers. So they take Burger King versus McDonald's. And they say, okay, we're going to go in and we're going to see how often people are in a good mood, right? We can count that. How many people walk into McDonald's smiling versus how many people walk into Burger King smiling. We can count the amount of people smiling. Happens to be that more people are smiling at McDonald's than at Burger King. We can also look at the color choices of the wall. McDonald's is red and yellow. Burger King has this more rustic, right? They're like deeper reds and deeper yellows and deeper browns as far as their colors are concerned. Now we need to do is we need to explain this idea of like happy customers. That's the conclusion we're trying to reach. That's that third point of data that we're trying to get. You can't really measure happiness, right? But you can start to look at things that we can measure, and then that can give us a better understanding of what happiness is. We don't know where the plane is. We do know where it last checked in. We do know the last ping, and now we're trying to find this third point of data, right? That's what triangulation is. Take all the pieces of data you know, put them on a map, and then trying to figure out what's that last piece of data, all right? Likert scales, you just know what a Likert scale is. Likert scales, you've all done these before, right? 1 to 5, strongly disagree, disagree, undecided. You should always have a neutral option, agree, and then strongly agree. It's called a Likert scale. That's all you need to know. All right, you will do this on your last project here. Okay. Likert type scales use like things like on a scale of 1 to 5. Some of them have like 1 to 4. If you want people to actually make a choice as opposed to being like undecided or NA not applicable, you might force someone to make a choice. So anything that is not, if it's on a 1 to 5 scale and it does not say strongly disagree, disagree, undecided, agree, or strongly agree, it's a Likert type scale. So it's still like a 1 to 5 scale, a 1 to 7 scale, right? On a scale of whatever, right? But it doesn't use the same words, right? It's called a Likert type scale, right? Because it's similar to a Likert scale, it just, slight variation. It's still 1 to 5, but rarely, occasionally, often, very often. My teacher uses nonverbal cues in class. Sometimes, occasionally, often, very often. These are Likert type scales that aren't directly, strongly disagree to strongly agree. All right, semantic differential scales. Know what these are. This is on the exam. People get this wrong a lot on the exam, right? Make sure you know what this is. What this does is it measures meaning people ascribe to certain words and phrases, okay? And having these little gaps in between is important because people need to be able to make like very strong marks on the page. Okay, so what a semantic differential scale is, all right? You give people a word, all right, let's say rap music, and then you give them very opposite words in which they can sort of put on the scale how close or far away they are from various words. All right. So you give someone the word rap music and you want to figure out, how they feel about it. All right. Pleasant or unpleasant. And someone might say, it's pleasant. It's not like very, very pleasant, but it's like here as far as how pleasant it is. All right. Is it weak or is it strong? And someone will be like, oh, it's very strong. Right? Is it fast or is it slow? Ooh, it's more fast. Some of it's a little bit slow, but it's pretty fast. All right. So you're trying to figure out how people relate to certain words, right? The degrees that they're going to put it on this on a scale, on this sort of like fluid scale, back and forth between two polar opposite terms. All right. So you could have a term like politician, right? Honest, dishonest. You're like, okay, where are you at, right? You're gonna have, it's in this sort of like fluid somewhere in the middle, but people need to be able to make, a choice sort of along that continuum. Okay, so that's what a semantic differential scale is. Just know what it is, and it's used to, figure out how people feel about certain words or ideas. You could do something like in the political realm, people are going to do things like, they'll have like far left, far right. It's like, it's probably somewhere in the middle, right? Like center, am I center left? Am I center right? Am I pretty solidly on the left? Am I solidly on the right? Right? Am I really far one way? Right? That's, people describing their politics might use a scale like this. Okay, when people are reporting, when participants or subjects are reporting how they're feeling, there's two ways in which you can get information about people: self-reporting or other reporting. So self-reporting, the person who is being studied answers the questions. The pros of this is you're going to get the firsthand information. The cons of this is that people sometimes exaggerate. So if you say, how often do you do your homework, and you say, I study 5 hours a day, you probably don't, but you probably think you do, or you think you ought to study that much, or you have what's called a social desirability bias. So even if the surveys are anonymous, or if the researcher says, I'm going to keep this confidential, people have this social desirability bias where they say things that they think they should be doing because they want to have a good opinion of themselves, or they want other people to have a good opinion of them. Like, I don't want the researcher to think that I'm lazy when it comes to my study habit, so I'm going to tell them I study a little bit more than I do, right? How often do you read a book? Some people are like, oh, I read a book once a week, right? And it's really like maybe like once a month, but I feel like I should read one once a week, so I answer it in this exaggerated form. How often do you work out? You probably lie to your doctor about how often you work out, right? Or how many fruits and vegetables you eat in a day. So this is why self-reporting, it's good if people are very honest because they have the first person information. Like, I know how often I work out. I know how many fruits and vegetables I eat. I know how many books I read. The cons is that even unknowingly sometimes I fall into social desirability. So even if I don't intend to lie, my brain might just exaggerate for me because I think I should probably read more or eat more vegetables or work out more than I actually do. All right. So that's the pros and cons, right? There's no right answer with regard to should you do something self-reporting or other reporting, but what you could do is a triangulation, right? So you could, let's talk about other reporting. We'll talk about the triangulation stuff in a second here. All right. Other reporting. Other people are asked to describe a person who's being studied. So let's talk about homework habits. How often do you do your homework every night? You might say 3 hours a night. That sounds pretty good because you kind of want to. Maybe you only do it for 2 hours, but you're like, I'll just round up, right? Just to kind of make it sound better. Now, I could go ask your parents, right? If you live at home with your parents, like how often does your son or daughter do homework? And they might say, well, they're only in their bedroom doing homework for 2 hours a night, right? Now, the con of this, obviously, is you might be doing homework when mom and dad don't know you're doing homework. So maybe you're doing homework somewhere else, and they only see you in your bedroom doing homework. But maybe you did a little bit of homework at the library before you came home after school. So they don't know that, right? The pros of having other people report is those other people are less likely to engage in social desirability bias. So they're less likely to lie for you with regard to, different various habits. It's good to have outside perspective sometime, right? This is why we have things like athletic coaches. You think you're super awesome when it comes to your sport. The coaches are the one that can see you, making weird little mistakes here and there that you don't even know, right? So it's good to have outside perspective. Okay, so this is how other reporting works. If I'm trying to figure out, how often, college students do homework, if they live at home with their parents, I could ask their parents. I could ask their roommates if they live in an apartment with their roommates. And I might get two different answers between the people who are reporting for themselves and the people who are reporting, like their parents are reporting for them. Now, this is how triangulation could work. I could say, okay, I have this answer where you say you studied for 3 hours. Mom and dad say you only studied for 1 hour. Now I got to figure out the triangulation. It's like, how many hours a day do you actually study, right? That's what I'm trying to figure out. You think it's a little bit higher. Mom and dad think it's a little bit lower. Is it maybe somewhere in the middle in here, right? This is what researchers would do in this type of situation. They're trying to figure out what the actual number is. And unless I'm following you around 24/7, I have to start making some estimates based on what you say, what your parents say, and now I'm going to triangulate that to figure out what the real correct answer is with regard to study habits for college students. When it comes to asking questions, you could have a questionnaire or you could have an interview. A questionnaire is I give you a sheet of paper and you fill out the answers on your own, like you sit at your desk quietly and fill out the answers, right? Like a Scantron, or you could write out the answers. An interview is I, sit there across from you and I ask you the questions and I write down your answers. So there's obviously pros and cons to this. The pros of you sitting quietly by yourself is that you don't feel distracted. The cons of you sitting quietly by yourself is you might have a clarifying question. One of the questions might not be as clear as it needs to be, and you might not know what it is you're answering. If I interview you, if I talk to you face to face, the pro is that I can make sure that my questions are very, very clear, right? The con is that you might engage in social desirability. You might give me the answers I want. You might have a bias towards me. If I'm a bad interviewer, or you think I don't like you for some reason, you might not be willing to open up as much, right? So you might have prejudice or bias against the person who's interviewing you, and that's going to change the way in which you answer the questions. All right. So there's pros and cons to each of these. Closed questions versus open questions. This is definitely on the next exam, so know what it is. Closed questions is there's only a couple of answers that you could give, right? There's like a direct answer that you can give. Open-ended is like you could go off for, sentences, if not paragraphs, with regard to the question involved. So closed questions has a direct, most of the time, one-word answer. How do you feel about giving public speeches? Is this closed or open? It's opened. There's a million different directions you can go. You could talk a very long time about this. How many public speeches have you given in the past 12 months? That's a closed question, right? I've given 1. I've given 20. I've given 1,000, right? But there's like a one-word direct closed answer. You give the answer and you move on. You see this a lot when it comes to politicians being interviewed by the media. The media says, sir or ma'am, like, can you just answer yes or no? Do you support this policy? That's a closed question. It's a yes or no question, and the politicians go off on this long tangent, and they're like, well, it's kind of complicated, and we don't really know. And they treat it as if it's an open question. Really, it's like, no. I'm asking directly, yes or no. Do you support this bill? And they won't answer it. They treat it like an open question when really it's a closed question. So when you see a question, if it has a one-word direct answer, it's a closed question. If it could go in many, many different directions, it's an open question. Know the difference. You want to avoid leading questions, right? So I had an example here, but the YouTube clip is taken down because it was from MSNBC, and I think MSNBC just had like a copyright thing on it, right? I'll talk to you about it in a second. But a leading question is when you are sort of backing an interviewee into a corner where they have to answer a question where maybe they completely disagree with the entire premise of the question, or there's no way in which they could answer the question that would be correct, or that would be correct. All right. So you want to avoid leading questions. You don't want to drive the interview in a way where the person who's being interviewed can't answer in multiple forms or fashion, right? Okay. So there was this MSNBC interview, and I'm gonna butcher it a little bit, but I'll keep the leading question aspect of it true to what it was. And there was a person on MSNBC asking Senator Elizabeth Warren about when Senator Mitch McConnell had shut her down. So a couple years ago, there was this famous sort of like "she persisted" hashtag that went around Twitter because Mitch McConnell said that Senator Warren was no longer allowed to speak on this issue that she was wanting to speak about because of like rules and procedures and all this other kind of stuff. He's like, your time's up, like, let's move on, okay? So that was the sort of extent of the situation. An interviewer on MSNBC comes out and asks Senator Elizabeth Warren, like, something to the extent of like, how did you feel about the sexism in Mitch McConnell's request that you no longer speak, right? Now that's a leading question, and the leading question is because it assumes that there's sexism in Mitch McConnell telling Senator Warren that her time is up with regard to no longer being able to speak on the Senate floor. And it assumes that Senator Warren felt like it was sexism as opposed to just a procedural issue. To Senator Warren's credit, Senator Warren came back and said, well, I'm not really sure if like sexism was in play here, but then she went off and she's like, but I do think it's important that senators are allowed to speak and to sort of, make their points so that all the information is on the table before we take a vote and the American people know what we're being, asked about, et cetera, right? So if you ask someone like, she could have said like, do you feel as if sexism was at play with regard to Mitch McConnell making it so that you were no longer allowed to speak on the Senate floor? And then Senator Warren could have said, yeah, I think there was sexism, here you go. Or no, I don't think there was sexism. Or the interviewer could have said like, how did you feel, not even use the word sexism, how did you feel about, Mitch McConnell interrupting your speech? Senator Warren could have said like, oh, I think it was like, is this major sexist move on his part? Or she could have said like, oh, I didn't like it, and I think he's a, terrible person for interrupting me, right? But it would have allowed Senator Warren to define the situation as she saw it unfolding, as opposed to leading her down this road of like sexism was definitely there. All right. So you want to make sure that you avoid leading questions where you're putting ideas into the interviewee's head that the interviewee might not even be thinking about. All right. So there you go. Avoid leading questions. Make sure you're trying to ask very neutral questions. A couple different ways you can present questions. This will definitely be on the exam. All right. Directive is a predetermined sequence of questions. All right. They're very direct. This is a very common way. All right. So if I'm going to interview you, right, qualitative methods, I have a set of 10 questions. With you and the 50 other participants, I'm just reading off the exact same questions in that order. There's no deviation from the script. That's what's important here, right? This is the same as a structured interview, right? It's predetermined. I follow a script, end of story. Okay. This is different than non-directive. Non-directive means that your answers determine the question I go to next, right? So you might get a different set of questions than a different person who's being interviewed for the same study because you answered the questions in a different way. So the next question is dependent on the previous question, the previous answer you gave. All right. A semi-structured interview, which is different than a structured interview, obviously, is that I have a list of, let's say, 10 questions that I'm going to ask all 50 people, but I'm free to ask some follow-ups or ask for clarification. In a structured interview, all right, I just read the 10 questions or however many questions I have. I read the 10 questions in the same order to everyone. They answer the questions. I am not allowed to say anything else except ask the questions and move on. In a semi-structured interview, I have a list of 10 questions. If a person gives an interesting answer, I can ask for clarification. I can ask a little bit of a follow-up, right? That's a semi-structured interview. All right. And then finally, we have an unstructured interview, which is I provide a list of topics, but as an interviewer, I'm more trying to engage in a conversation with you. I don't really have a firm list of questions. All right. Now, all of these have their pros and cons. Obviously, if I ask everyone the same question in the same order with regard to a structured interview, that's going to yield certain results. Where if I go more of an unstructured way where I just say, look, I want to talk to people about this topic, and everybody's interview is going to unfold in various ways, right? Because we're going to go in very, very different directions. All right. So there's pros and cons to all these types of ways of presenting questions. You just have to figure out qualitatively how am I going to structure these interviews in order to try to get to the questions I'm trying to answer. All right, and finally, when it comes to observations, you can have direct observations or you can have indirect observations. Direct observations usually happen in a laboratory, right, or some sort of location with clear boundaries or barriers, right? Classroom, a church, athletic practice, right? It's direct, like people are there, all right? The pros is that you can control the variables, some of the variables, so you can control like what happens. The con is that people might change their behavior if they know they're being observed. So if I bring a bunch of people into a laboratory and say, okay, hang out with each other, I'm going to observe you, they know they're being observed, they're going to change their behavior. So this becomes a problem with direct observations. But again, I can control all the elements in a laboratory that I can't control outside of a laboratory. All right. Indirect, usually observing artifacts from previous communications, right? So if I'm looking at like transcribed speeches, films, books, paintings, whatever, right? The pro is that the behavior was not manipulated by my studies. So when people produce these things, they didn't know it was going to be studied. So they didn't have the added weight of like, ooh, I better be careful because someone's going to analyze this. The con is that I can't necessarily ask any follow-up questions or clarifications because, this can be difficult to find the intent, right? So if I'm studying, a film from 100 years ago, I can't go back to everyone involved in the film and ask some follow-up clarification questions. If I go directly to an athletic practice, let's say I'm observing sports behavior, right? Sports fandom. I might go through, I might talk to people in the stadium. I might talk to the coaches and the athletes and say, hey, I'm here doing some research. Like, can I ask you some questions? They could clarify. I can say, like, I noticed you did something in practice today that you didn't do last week, right? They can clarify why they changed up their practice routines, right? Now, the con of that is now they know that they're being watched, and so they might change their behavior further than they wouldn't have otherwise, right? But at least I can get a better sense of clarification as to why they chose to act a certain way and not act a different way. If I go through some old films, maybe there's old athletic films, and I see that teams, are playing different from week to week. If I'm studying basketball teams in the 1950s, right? I see that they're playing differently, but their behavior wasn't manipulated. They didn't play differently because I was there observing them. But the con is that I can't follow up and ask for clarification. Like, why did you choose this game strategy week 1 and this different game strategy game 2? All right. So there's pros and cons to both direct and indirect observations. Okay, that's all I have. Make sure that you just know these terms today. All right. I will see you next time.